The Top of the City Community Garden team have been at it again. Not only have they turned a neglected piece of land into a lovely amenity for the city with a farmer's market to boot, but now they've only gone and made a documentary on something they first became aware of as they cleared the land for the garden. That documentary is called The Forgotten Barracks, and it's one of those documentaries that future generations will be grateful that somebody took the time to put together. One of the people involved is local historian James Doherty. James, good morning.
Hey, Maria.
I didn't realise until I watched the documentary how expansive this whole thing was.
I suppose a lot of Waterford's history is kind of hidden often in plain sight. People often ask me, was there a British Army barracks in the city? And then we start explaining, that's why we have a Barrack Street, and Military Road, Cannon Street. It all starts to make a bit more sense. And although a lot of the buildings are gone, there's little kind of traces and remnants of different parts of the exterior left, if you kind of know where to look and if you know what you're looking for, but easy to walk by. And yeah, the British Army in Waterford, like every, I suppose, town or city in Ireland, was a huge part of everyday life.
And I would imagine that you walking around looking at these places, you see an awful lot more than ordinary people who would have no clue about why it's called Barrack Street or anything. Because as I was watching the documentary and you'd point things out, and I'd be going why did I never not notice that before?
Yeah, I suppose a lot of it is, I always had an interest in military history, and I spent a large kind of part of my life living around that area, so I know it very well. But a lot of these things, it's like anything, it's evident if someone shows you, and once you start to kind of learn almost like little tricks of the trade, like how to look at the old ordnance survey maps, how to look at place names and different resources, and most of which are out there for everyone to use, it kind of becomes easier to find a lot of this kind of history that's basically all around us. That's why I like occasionally doing kind of walking tours now. It's not a thing I do at the moment, but I was doing them for the Imagine Arts Festival before, kind of dark history walking tours. And when you show and point to people these remnants of our history, it's all very evident. But like you said, unless you kind of get that chance to wander around and have something pointed out to you, sometimes it's easy to miss as well.
And how did you get involved in the documentary?
The usual Waterford thing of a friend of a friend favours for people. So I've done a lot of stuff before with Imagine Arts, Ollie Breslin, and Justina in the community gardens, Top of the City Community Gardens, was in contact with the lads in Waterford Youth Arts. And they want to kind of get to know a bit of the history of the area. And basically I was kind of put forward as a good person to talk to. But it's the usual thing. Waterford is great for it. No budget as such for a lot of these things, but it's usually like a friend of a friend and all that kind of stuff. But I don't mind helping out. Like, it's a nice project to be involved in, and people find it very interesting. So it's nice to explore that part of our history.
Justina and everyone involved in the Top of the City Community Garden, they're great, aren't they, for just trying to maximise what we have in Waterford and inform people of what's been there.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if any of your listeners have had a chance to explore or even see the new gardens up behind the old Cartridges Avenue, but it was a wide space. It attracted a lot of antisocial behaviour. They took tons of empty drink cans and bottles out of that space. And it really now has transformed what was kind of almost, a mecca for antisocial behaviour into a nice community asset. And when they started establishing the garden, because it's on the site of the old military barracks, they wanted to find out a little bit more about the history. So that's when I was asked to help out and get involved.
You were explaining in the documentary, and I'm going to ask you to clarify now because I can't remember which is which. Yeah. Which were the rich ones, the infantry or the cavalry? Is that the right two?
Yes. Generally, the cavalry tended to come from a wealthier background because basically you had to own a horse, etc. And they generally built the cavalry and infantry apart. If you were a cavalry soldier, you would have considered yourself a slightly better social class. So Waterford, like a lot of military garrison towns, had two big barracks. We had an infantry barracks and a cavalry barracks. The entrance to the infantry barracks can still be seen today. It's at the site of Waterford Youth Arts, the archway, and that's stretched all the way back basically towards the Green and Ballybricken. Then you also had a huge cavalry barracks just up the street, which seems odd, but they were kind of separate. So just beside the Spar in Barrack Street, the site of what is St Cartridge's Avenue, just across from Norris's Corner. That was a cavalry barracks. And later on, the cavalry in Waterford, stopped being a thing, and the Waterford militia trained there. And the Waterford militia became an artillery militia. They trained with artillery pieces, and then the barracks became known as the artillery barracks. So people often refer to 3 barracks. We only had 2. One originally was called the Cavalry Barracks, and later that became referred to as the Artillery Barracks when the armies became a bit more modern.
But none of these would have been Waterford people. Like the cavalry would have been British soldiers, would it?
Yeah. So the way the military worked in the British Empire, they tended to rotate. They didn't like units staying in the same place too long because basically men settled down, they got married, they had children, and that all becomes a financial drain on any military unit. If they're moving, all of a sudden Maria is tagging along with 3 children or whatever, So the infantry units and the cavalry units tend to rotate around. Now, often what happened when they got to places like Waterford, they'd recruit local men, because if you're in command of a unit and you're meant to have 500 soldiers, through war, through waste, through death or whatever, if you're short-staffed, you pick up a few locals as you kind of go along. So you'd often find a smattering of Irish soldiers in all these units. But you could have units in Waterford on a regular basis from any part of the British Empire. If you read the old reports, the reports of German Lancers, Hessians, who were loyal to the British Empire, in a barracks for my Polish Lancers, again part of the British Empire in the old days, travelling through Cork, Scottish units, Welsh units, English units, and these would spend a certain period of time in Waterford, and then they'd move on. They could be going to America, they could be going to India, they could be going back to England for garrison duty, but they basically spent their whole time kind of rotating around the British Empire. So it was all very, I suppose, it was all very kind of transient, and different units tended to have different relationships with the city. You'd often see the mayor of Waterford saying, "Oh God, we're very sorry to see the nice lads from the Scottish Highlands leave Waterford next week, and I've just been informed that the Welsh unit are coming, and the last time they were here there was awful trouble with some of the locals, and I'd prefer to have the Scottish fellas back." It just varied. Different units got on better or worse with the locals, basically.
And I presume
the city was happy to see some of them. They weren't so happy to see other ones.
I presume, looking at one of the photographs there, one of the soldiers, he had what looks to me like what you'd see outside of Buckingham Palace, like the bearskin hat, and I think the narrator said it would have been a red coat. Would that have been a spectacle in the streets? Would they have worn that stuff?
Yeah,
that must have been some spectacle.
They're very colourful, very exotic men, and that often created tension. There was often a lot of violence between local men and soldiers because these soldiers arrive into the city, they dress differently, they have a nice tan, they tell tales of seeing elephants and tigers in India, they've travelled the world. Also, they have a roof over their head and they receive a steady pay. So they have a lot of disposable income, which they tend to spend in pubs, etc., etc. And this led to tension between local guys because usual thing, soldiers chatting to the local girls find these guys all very interesting and exotic. So yeah, it could lead to tension, but they definitely would have been a spectacle, and especially when they went on recruitment drives, they'd send the band, or they'd send the regimental mascots, big Irish wolfhounds, and all very well dressed. And it was always the old saying of take the king's shilling, travel the world, and see exotic places. They didn't tend to mention quite a lot of dies, so that's
the bad part of it
at the start. But yeah, they would have recruited quite heavily. If you look at probably one of the most famous old battles of the British Empire, the Battle of Waterloo, about a third of the British Army at Waterloo was Irish. So the British Army through the 18th and 19th century had a huge proportion of Irish soldiers. These are men just looking for work. They wanted a steady wage. But also some of them wanted to get away from a very kind of mundane life at home, on the farm or whatever. But yeah, there was a huge Irish population within the British armed forces for most of its history.
And this video was only supposed to be 15 minutes long initially. A lot of work has gone into it because it's 45 minutes long now.
Yeah, so look, it's a big topic to cover, and I suppose people think that the thought was that to give it some adequate background. But I think the people are interested, watchers. I think especially for people living in the area, they'll find it very interesting. For school teachers based in the city who want, they're covering the British Empire in school with the children, they'll find it a good resource. So it's hard to condense hundreds of years of history into a kind of a small package.
Well, it's very interesting, and well done to everybody who was involved in it, including yourself, James, and thanks a million for talking to me.
No problem, Maria. I said I was glad to help, and in a way, I had an easy job. I just turn up and I talk about stuff that I have an interest in, and then I go away again. People doing the editing and all that have a lot harder, a lot more labour intensive than what I had to do. But listen, thanks for having me on, Maria. It was always a pleasure to talk to you.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.